So Zhai Gen, thanks a lot for joining. Could you please tell us about yourself briefly? What are you doing now, and what's your background? And perhaps you can talk a little bit about yourself that might be related to the topic that we're gonna talk about later.
Yeah, so I'm Zhai Gen. So I'm a research manager at the Asia School of Business. It's a university, a new university based here in Kuala Lumpur. I think my own background, used to be a biochemist, right? I did biochemistry, and I thought, and I came back. There are a lot more other questions that are a little bit much more interesting, right, to me. And I think one very important area uh, that ended up becoming a good part of my research work in a think tank here before joining my university here is on food security, right? Trying to understand from a food standpoint, which is something very, very ubiquitous across our lives, as if it's very easy to obtain, right? What is behind it? What is keeping this system alive, so to speak, right? How is keeping it resilient, right, so to speak, right? Do we always have food that is with us? So I think that is really one big area that I work in, right?
How do you see the idea of resiliency in terms in not just limited into architecture, of course, but into other sector, into other different kind of disciplines as well? What do you see the overarching urgency that we need to focus, and also how do you see the word resiliency? Because I'm sure there must be different kind of perception when we talk about like green architecture. Is like, wow, that sounds ambitious, but at the same time we have to beware of before we fall into this trap of greenwashing, for example. So how do you see
Mm,
resiliency, and
mm, mm,
also what
mm,
kind of urgencies do you find that
mm,
you are mainly tackling on now?
mm. So I think the way I see resiliency is I think maybe I would say a couple of things. One, resiliency to me is about one understanding that. So I take an example of food, which I work on, and also of course energy and the other work that I do look into the integrity of that system. So everything is within that system. So the resiliency of a system, right, is about it being able to withstand shock, right? Is So if I take food and so not just shock, but also that it's sustainable in the long term, right? So it does not apply just in the, I believe, the sort of ESG or green kind of a concept. Instead, to me, is this, right? Because of the condition that we are in, we need to become more sustainable. We have to. The urgency is there because the system has gone away from its equilibrium with increasing temperatures, right? That's already on the path already. Take food as an example. It's going to threaten what kind of food you can produce in, say, different countries because temperatures are growing. Food production may fall, for example. So, because of all of these changes or destabilization of the system that has given us, right, the food and also the kind of our lives here, there's an urgency of us needing to change it. So therefore, resiliency is being able to withstand all of these changes and shocks, right? And of course, to me, currently the system is not resilient enough, and that's why all these different policies and also, of course, all this advocacy is coming in, right, to be able to increase, right, that resiliency, not just physically in buildings and so on, but also in the community, also in the understanding of our uh, local and or even global communities and citizens on how to make sure that our system continues to be resilient or become more resilient.
One question is, when we talk
Mm,
about these produce shocks, are they
mm,
mainly I'm sure they impose from all directions, but do you think is it
mm,
because of cultural, meaning to say how we use or how we eat
mm,
use a certain resources, or is it because of political, means there will be some policies or
mm,
regulations that set
mm,
up from the top, or do you think it's
mm,
because of climatic in a way? So
mm,
when we
mm,
talk about food security, do you
mm.
think these three, which one has the most impact or obvious impact on food security? I'm quite curious about that.
So I think food security, maybe if start from the conceptual level, right? Food security comprises of four things, right? Food availability, how much food there is, food affordability, how affordable food it is, food accessibility, or how in different conditions or different locations in the country or community, how easy is that are they to get food, and at the end is nutrition, right? How well are they eating, right? Or how nutritious are they eating? So I think when we think about the different factors that are affecting the resiliency, it can be all of the above that you just described, right? Because that's how the whole thing works as a system, right? So different factors affect it. Some may be more important than others, and depending on the context. So I think I will give an example of Malaysia, right? I think we are very blessed, and I think in terms of food availability, by and large, we do have enough, and sometimes more than enough to eat, both local produce and also from imports. So what and in terms of food accessibility, we are blessed to be a very peaceful country. We don't get wars and so on, which break the kind of food that we have. However, one problem that we have is in terms of nutrition, right? And that's where I think a couple of things come in, right? One, as you mentioned, in terms of cultural impact of food, right? The culture of food that has been generated is unhealthy, right? We are the second most obese country in Asia, right? We have one of the highest rates of diabetes in the country. The amount of sugar we eat is a lot, right? So I think partly one the cultural aspect of it, how Malaysians have became to it, how our parents ate became how we ate, right? But that itself did not come out of nowhere too, right? For example, we had very high sugar subsidies from back in the days, and that might have a triggered, right? That, and I think there was a second policy decision where sugar is a very cheap source of carbohydrates, right? In a time of scarcity in the 60s and 70s, perhaps, you would promote sugar because it's the fastest way and the cheapest way that population can get sugar. But today, right, as the country has become a lot more richer than what we are suffering the consequences of that. Even though we're rich enough, we're still eating a lot of sugar, for example, right? So a policy change has led to this cultural moment. But again, Malaysia is not alone, right? Middle income countries like Indonesia, Mexico, we are seeing what we call double burden of malnutrition because of this, right? You have very high rates of obesity and overweight, but also very high rates of stunting, right? So children do not have enough, both especially micronutrients, right? Things like iron and so on. Now, how did this come about, right? Partly it's cultural, right? Partly, but that cultural aspect does stem out of many different factors. One could be policy, another could just be the memory of famine, right? So partly in Malaysia, the memory of famine during the Japanese era sort of triggers that sense that when there's enough food, you eat a lot more, right? Because who knows when your next meal is. And even though it has been so many years past, that memory, that community memory may remain. So I think a lot of these different factors can lead to this phenomenon. And I think so that's what I would say. It's all of the above. And I guess, of course, to also talk about that, mention about what will happen in the future, climate change will definitely be a big factor, right? Now you have another factor coming in, threatening to change all of that, right? Whether or not increase rainfall will reduce the production of food, of rice, for example, which is staple for the country. What's next, right, for the country? What do we do, right? Is our system resilient enough to continue to provide that kind of food? So I think, and that's where the way I see food security is that it's a multifaceted, multifactorial kind of question, and therefore to ensure that the resiliency and continuity of our food supply, we will have to think about all of them at once. Sure, there are some major areas as I described: nutrition, climate change, but really it's a context of the whole country and the whole community, that is very most important.
Coming back to the idea, the topic on food security,
Mm,
we mentioned about availability and also nutrition. These 2
mm,
points are the two things
mm.
that I noticed highlighting when we talk about traditional food, because it seems to be is
Yep.
long dating to our lifestyle. I mean, Nasi Lemak seems to
Mm,
be. I don't think you wanted to change Nasi
mm-hmm.
Lemak to something much more healthy. It might change
Mm,
the. I mean, you can, but it's just that it might
mm.
not fit the same taste anymore. So
Yeah,
when it comes
yeah.
to that, I perhaps that's the thing that also Time to Rise mentioned about this kind of
Mm,
urgency where perhaps Nasi
yeah.
Lemak might go in danger kind of thing. So
Correct. Correct.
so I mean, how do you see that when we talks about this kind of a traditional cultural value and heritage linking back to the urgency when we are facing
Mm,
in climatic? One is much more realistic, one is much more a bit what we are living in the kind of ideal world now. How do you
mm,
see
mm,
that kind of tangible relationship in tackle
mm,
of
mm, mm.
wanted to serving a nice tradition value or the same taste, but at the same time we want to
Mm,
ensure that the Malaysians
mm,
eat
mm,
healthy, and at the same time
mm,
I don't know, maybe one day Santan might
mhm.
go into danger and shortage
Yeah.
or things like this. So how do you see
Yeah.
that?
So I think so one way of thinking about it is this. I think a lot of our traditional food, right, has come through generations and generations of iteration, right? You perhaps you can make an assumption that if this food has survived tradition throughout this generation, that means there is a certain nutritional value to it, right? Or rather, it has certain balanced nutritional value to it, right? So I think it's I, I I don't think there's really a one or the other, right? It's a question of evolution, right? So even if I think the traditional food may be, for example, less healthy, I think as we understand, or rather as we push the question of nutrition and ensuring that we have enough food for all, and good food for all, those things, that tradition need not be eliminated, but rather improved, right? Or rather it evolves. So I think that is something that I think it will come to that. Um, so yeah, no, I don't see that there is a inherent contradiction, right? When the pursuit of that, but I think what is therefore more important is the question of and I think it comes down to the question of when it comes to sustainability, right? Either do you adapt to it or you try to prevent it from happening, right?
Mm,
Prevent the extinction of Nasi Lemak to happen at the same time. And I think perhaps in this case, it's a question of adaptation, right? As we slowly move. Um, but of course, some basic things will still need to be preserved, right? Nasi Lemak will still have rice, right? Without rice, and rice is still a staple food for the country, right?
mm,
Without rice, we will threaten the food security, or rather the food supply of for our population. So
mm,
that needs to be preserved, for
mm,
example. And I think that's what the Time to Rise co-creation game workshop really tries to challenge that notion, right? Perhaps we will change the form of nasi lemak. That's what some of our respondents have said too. Uh, or there are other ways of doing it, and I think there's always never no one path to do it, right?
mm,
So, but what we can anticipate perhaps is the question of as we adapt, as we change, as the evolution of nasi lemak perhaps take place in this world of trying to create more resilience in growing climate crisis. uh, what is the path all of us take.
mm.
But the most important thing is to really think about it and really find a path out and not remain in status quo. Yeah. I would say that it's great to hear, and it's great for, when we think about sustainability and so on, to go beyond, I think, the spaces that we reside in, right? And I think I have the privilege of being a researcher in a university where our job is to go beyond that, to look outside and say, right, what is everybody thinking about? But I think this is also our role in the society to really, help put all this, or rather, if we may not have the answers, but then at the very least, we ask that question. right?
Mm.
And hopefully more and more people ask that question and think about from their own perspective and their own expertise what those answers are. So yeah, I
Mm.
think that is perhaps what I hope.